Some dares are meant to be refused. The abandoned church at the edge of our town stood as a monument. To fear, its hollow windows like watchful eyes, its crooked spire clawing at the sky. The stories about it were endless whispers of rituals, shadows that moved on their own, and screams heard only by those foolish enough to stand too close. I never believed in ghosts or curses, not until I stepped inside. What I found wasn't just waiting, it was alive, and it wanted me. The crackling bonfire barely lit the faces of my friends, their laughter ringing out into the cool night air. Danny's grin was wicked as he leaned toward me, holding an unopened beer like a prize. "All right, Jack," he said. "We've all done something tonight. Your turn." I scoffed, feigning confidence. "What is it?" Danny's finger shot out, pointing toward the shadowed outline of the abandoned church in the distance. "Go in there. Stay for 10 minutes. The laughter around the fire died instantly. The church was more than a building. It was a challenge. Wrapped in folklore, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. Rumors of ghostly chants and figures in the air. Pews swirled in our town like leaves in the wind. "Seriously," I asked, my stomach sinking. "Unless you're scared," Danny taunted, shaking the beer. "Fine," I snapped, grabbing my flashlight. The group cheered, their voices fading as I crossed the field, toward the crumbling building. The church loomed larger as I approached, its door sagging like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The wood creaked ominously as I pushed it open. A burst of cold air hit me, carrying the faint scent of decay. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a cannon blast. I spun around, heart pounding. But no one was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Ahead, in the pitch-black void, a faint rustling broke the silence. A whisper too soft to make out. Brushed past my ear. My breath hitched. "Hello," I called, the sound of my voice swallowed by the full, repressive darkness. The air felt alive, heavy with something unseen. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and a single, dreadful thought gripped me: I shouldn't be here. Then, from deeper within the church, came the sound of footsteps. Not mine. The heavy door shut behind me with an unnatural force, the slam reverberating like a warning shot. Through the desolate space, my flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling against the oppressive darkness. I froze, ears straining. The footsteps I'd heard moments ago had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Not the kind of quiet you find in an empty room, but the suffocating stillness that feels alive. I took a shaky step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath me like they resented my intrusion. The air was thick, damp, and carried a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The flashlight swept. Across the pews, their wood splintered and cracked, each one holding shadows deeper than they should. 10 minutes, I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. From somewhere near the altar, a faint scraping sound broke the silence. I swung the flashlight wildly, its beam catching nothing but dust swirling in the stale air. My hands trembled, causing the light to jitter like a warning. As I moved closer, my shoes scuffed against something soft. I looked down to see a small, crumpled piece of fabric, a child's shoe, covered in dirt and lying disturbingly out of place. The sound came again, louder this time, like nails dragging across stone. My pulse spiked as the beam of my flashlight landed on a door near the back of the church. It was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable blackness beyond. The scraping grew louder, closer, as if whatever was behind it knew I was there. I swallowed hard and took another step. My foot nudged something else, this time a dusty teddy bear, with one eye missing. Cold dread crawled up my spine. The bear looked freshly placed. The whisper returned, clearer now. It wasn't coming from behind the door. It was right next to me. The whisper ceased, leaving an eerie void in its wake. My breath hitched as I turned slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the altar at the far end of the church. It wasn't what I expected. The altar was carved from stone, blackened and rough, with strange symbols etched deep into its surface. My eyes darted over the markings, unable to decipher their meaning, but the longer I stared, the more. They seemed to shift, their shapes writhing like living things. My stomach churned. Blood. The grooves were filled with dried blood. A metallic clinking echoed through the silence. I whipped around, the flashlight catching the glint of rusted chains bolted to the floor in front of the altar. A chill ran through me as I noticed the frayed remnants of fabric tangled in the links, as if someone had desperately struggled to escape. Then I saw the markings on the wall behind the altar. A jagged, circular symbol carved deep into the stone, glowing faintly. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting flickering shadows across the room. The shadows weren't random, they moved with purpose, circling the altar like they were waiting for something. I stepped closer, my shoes crunching on scattered shards of glass. The pulsing grew louder, like drumming inside my skull. I reached out, compelled by some invisible force, when a voice, hoarse and guttural, rasped from the shadows, "Do you seek to take their place?" I stumbled back, the flashlight beam catching something moving in the corner of the room. Not someone, something. Its form twisted unnaturally, limbs too long, its face obscured by the dark. Stepped closer, and I saw its eyes. They weren't human. The chains on the floor rattled violently as if whatever had been bound there was waking. A cold realization washed over me. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't in control anymore. The chains rattled again, louder this time, as if something unseen was struggling against them. My flashlight flickered violently, plunging the room into erratic bouts of darkness. The low, guttural voice from the shadows echoed once more, clearer now, each word a dagger of fear. "Why have you come?" My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the pew for balance. In the shifting light, the shadowy figure I had glimpsed before began to take shape. It stepped closer, moving with a jerking, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face, half obscured, was gaunt and hollow, the eyes, if they were eyes, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam falling onto the altar. The pulsing symbol behind it grew brighter, casting an eerie glow across the entire room. Then, the figure stepped fully into the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its skin stretched tightly over bones that jutted unnaturally. Its mouth hung open, a gaping void that seemed to whisper, even when no sound came. "You broke the seal," it hissed, its voice layered as if multiple entities were speaking at once. A wave of cold air swept through the room, biting at my skin. I couldn't breathe, the air felt thick, suffocating, charged with something ancient and angry. The chains rattled again, and this time they snapped. The sound rang out like a gunshot. My flashlight flickered off completely, plunging the room into total darkness. And then I heard it, the sound of something massive shifting behind me, something that shouldn't have been able to move. A deep, resonating growl filled the air, vibrating through my chest. I turned, the dim glow of the pulsing symbol illuminating a second figure, larger than the first, emerging from the corner. It loomed over me, its form indistinct, but its intent unmistakable. It whispered my name. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive dark. Something had been waiting for me, all along. The whisper of my name still hung in the air, like a knife pressed to my throat. The massive figure loomed closer, and my survival instincts kicked in. I bolted for the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I scrambled over broken pews, their splinters clawing at my hands. Behind me, the growl deepened into a roar that shook the floor. I dared to glance back and instantly regretted it. The figure stretched impossibly, its arms reaching toward me like liquid shadows, elongating and snaking across the room. One hand scraped along the walls, leaving black scorch marks. The other hand was closer, too close. I ducked as it swiped just above my head, pulling the air into a whirl of icy wind that knocked me to the ground. Pain shot through my knees, but I forced myself to crawl, fumbling for the flashlight I'd dropped. It flickered to life, the beam cutting through the dark and illuminating the door ahead. But the door was wrong. The wood warped and twisted before my eyes, as though the church itself was alive, determined to trap me. I grabbed the handle, pulling with all my strength. It didn't budge. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and rising into an agonized wail that filled my ears. My vision blurred as tears of panic spilled over. Suddenly, the floor beneath me groaned. I froze. It was soft, almost spongy, as though something beneath the floorboards was shifting. Then it began to rise, a bulge forming under the wood, moving toward me. "Let me out," I screamed, pounding on the door, my voice a thin thread against the cacophony around me. The bulge erupted, splinters flying, and a clawed hand emerged, blackened and skeletal, reaching for my ankle. I kicked wildly, the flashlight slipping from my grip again and rolling into the shadows. I had no choice. Turned and ran deeper into the church, the growls and whispers pursuing me. The altar glowed faintly. Ahead, the only point of light in the suffocating dark. I wasn't escaping. I was being herded. Something wanted me to go deeper. I woke up to silence. For a moment, I thought I was dead. My body ached as if I had been pulled through a gauntlet of nails. But I was alive, or at least I thought I was. My breaths came shallow, catching on the lingering taste of ash in the air. The dim glow of the altar was gone, leaving me in near total darkness, save for the faint blue light filtering through the stained glass windows. I sat up slowly, wincing as my fingers brushed the raw, icy burn around my ankle, the place where that claw had gripped me. A blackened mark was etched into my skin, pulsing faintly like an open wound that wouldn't bleed. I couldn't look at it for long. The church was different now. The oppressive whispers were gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that felt even worse. Shadows pooled in the corners, deeper and darker than seemed natural. The air was thick and damp, and it carried a strange smell, earthy and metallic, like rusting iron. Something had changed, and I knew it wasn't over. I tried to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned toward the door. It was ajar now, the warped wood splintered as though something had forced it open. Relief flooded my chest until I noticed the trail. Blackened footprints led away from the door, not mine. Something had left before me. I stumbled outside, the chill of the night air hitting me like a slap. The world felt wrong. The stars overhead were dim, faintly distorted, as if I were seeing them through murky water. My village, visible in the distance, was too still. No lights in the windows, no sound of the wind, just silence. Then I heard it. A faint bell ringing from the direction of the church, low and mournful, echoing across the fields. The sound seemed to crawl under my skin, settling deep in my chest. I turned back slowly, dreading what I might see. The door was closed again, though I had left it open. Carved into its surface, fresh and glistening, was a single word: return. I knew I'd brought something back with me, something that wouldn't stop until I answered its call, something that was already watching. The bells are silent now, but the shadows still move. What would you do if the price of freedom was never being truly free? What would you do if something followed you home, and the only way to stop it was to go back, where it all began? I've lived in my small, isolated village all my life. Nestled in the shadow of the ancient forest, it was a place where time seemed to stand still, and the villagers clung to old traditions with unwavering faith. The most important among them was the worship of him, an unnamed deity we were forbidden to speak about, beyond whispered prayers. There was only one rule we had to follow: never disturb the altar at the heart of the forest. It was a simple command, etched into every villager's mind from childhood. But I broke it, and now I wish I'd never been born. The night was unusually quiet, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. As I sat by the dim firelight in my family's hut, the echoes of Elder Marin's words from earlier in the day filled my mind. Never disturb the altar in the forest. To do so is to invite his wrath upon us all. I had heard the warning my entire life, but tonight, the weight of it felt different. Tomas's challenge, whispered with a mischievous grin as the elders prayed, now gnawed at me. If you're not afraid, prove it. Touch the altar he had dared. The silence outside became suffocating, as though the village held its breath, against my better judgment. I slipped outside, the cold night air biting my skin. The path to the forest loomed ahead, shrouded in shadows that danced with the flicker of my lantern. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The trees, gnarled and ancient, seemed to lean toward me, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out. My lantern's light flickered, casting fleeting shapes that disappeared the moment I turned my head. When I reached the clearing, the altar stood in the center, as black as the starless sky above. It was an unassuming slab of stone, its surface etched with strange, twisting symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly. The air around it felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Just a rock, I muttered, trying to ignore the dread curling in my chest. But as my hand hovered over the altar, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The moment my fingers grazed the stone, the forest erupted. A deafening roar came from the shadows, the earth trembled violently, and an icy wind whipped through the clearing. Then came the whispers. Low and guttural, they seemed to come from everywhere, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The darkness pressed closer, and I stumbled back, my lantern falling and shattering. The altar pulsed with a dull, crimson glow. I turned to run, but the forest seemed alive now, branches clawing at my arms, roots twisting underfoot. A single, unearthly voice rose above the cacophony, deep and filled with rage. You have broken the sacred rule. And then silence. Only the whisper of my own breath remained, ragged and shallow, as I realized the village's greatest fear was no mere story. The village was eerily quiet when I stumbled back from the forest, my heart pounding like a drum. The weight of the voice's words, "You have broken the sacred rule," echoed in my head, refusing to fade. My fingers still tingled where they'd touched the altar, the skin rough and burned. As I reached the edge of the village, the lanterns were still extinguished. Shadows pooled unnaturally along the paths, as though the night itself had thickened. My mother was the first to see me. She ran out from the hut, her face a mask of worry and anger. "What have you done?" "Amara," she hissed, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to," I stammered, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. My words caught in my throat as her gaze shifted to my hand. She grabbed my wrist, her eyes widening in horror at the jagged scar now etched into my palm. "Go inside. Don't speak a word of this," she said, her tone sharp with desperation. "Pray he doesn't come." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the forest crept into my mind. The whispers followed me into the darkness, growing louder, overlapping, until they became screams. When I woke, my throat was raw, as if I had been screaming too. The next morning, I stepped outside and found the village transformed. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Villagers avoided my gaze, their movements sluggish. Even the animals were affected. The dogs refused to leave their kennels, whining softly, and the birds circled low over the rooftops, silent as death. It wasn't until I reached the well that I realized I wasn't imagining it. A faint voice, low and guttural, echoed in my ears. "Amara." I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the village. It was coming from the forest. I spun around, expecting someone to be there, but the well's edge was empty. My scar burned suddenly, painfully, and I gasped, clutching my hand. When I looked down, dark veins were snaking up my wrist, moving as though alive. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the whispers grew louder. They weren't distant anymore. They were coming from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. They knew my name, and they were coming closer. My mother lit a circle of candles around the hut, her trembling hand spilling wax onto the floor as she whispered prayers under her breath. "You brought this upon us," she muttered, tears streaming down her face. "We're all going to suffer." I sat in the corner, clutching my burning hand, the veins now creeping past my elbow, twisting like dark vines. My heart raced as the shadows in the room began to shift, growing longer, deeper, as though they had weight. Then came the pounding. It was slow at first, a deliberate knock against the walls of the hut. My mother froze, the color draining from her face. Her lips moved in silent prayer, but her voice was drowned out by the escalating noise. The pounding grew louder, more aggressive, shaking the very walls. The candles flickered violently, there, flames bending as if pushed by an unseen force. Amara, the voice was inside now, deep and resonant, reverberating in my chest. My mother screamed as the door flew open, slamming against the wall with a force that shattered the frame. The wind that entered was cold and sharp, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. A figure stood in the doorway, its shape obscured by the swirling darkness around it. Its eyes glowed an unnatural crimson, cutting through the dim light like embers in the night. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. "You defiled what is mine," the voice boomed, filling the room. "You will pay the price." The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed. My mother fell to her knees, begging for mercy. But her words fell on deaf ears. The ground beneath me began to crack, thin veins of red light seeping through the wooden floorboards. The hut trembled as the figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its gaze locked on me. I tried to run, but the darkness coiled around my legs, holding me in place. A sharp pain shot through my chest as the mark on my arm pulsed, glowing with the same crimson light as its eyes. "Your soul is mine," it growled, and everything went black. When I woke, the hut was gone, replaced by the chilling silence of the forest. The whispers were gone, but the weight of its wrath lingered, pressing down on me like a vice. The deity wasn't finished with me yet. The air in the forest felt suffocating, thick with an unnatural weight. When I sprawled against the cold earth where the hut had stood, I was surrounded by endless trees. There was no sign of the village or the warmth of home, only the eerie stillness of the woods. My scar throbbed like an open wound, casting a faint crimson glow on the gnarled roots beneath me. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling. The voice from before echoed faintly in the distance. "Return." Or face oblivion, the words sent shivers down my spine, and I realized the forest wasn't just quiet, it was alive. Branches seemed to twist and lean toward me as I moved, their jagged shapes like claws ready to snatch me away. The path ahead was dimly lit, illuminated only by the faint glow of my scar. The whispers returned, louder now, interwoven with distant, guttural laughter. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. "Amara," the voice whispered again, closer this time. My name felt like a poison dripping into my ears, and I clutched my head to drown it out, but the sound seeped deeper into my mind. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. Roots shot up, winding around my ankles. I screamed, falling forward, clawing at the dirt as the roots dragged me deeper into the forest. The shadows were no longer distant, they loomed, their forms vaguely human but grotesquely twisted. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and they moved with jerky, unnatural movements. The altar appeared again, as if the forest had bent around me to lead me there. It pulsed with a sinister light, the symbols on its surface shifting like snakes writhing in pain. My scar burned so intensely I thought it would split my skin. I wanted to run, to escape, but the forest held me in place. The altar called to me, a low hum vibrating. through the air. A cold, wet whisper brushed against my ear chews. I didn't know what it meant. But as the shadows closed in and the whispers grew deafening, I realized the forest was alive and I was its prey. The altar's glow intensified, bathing the clearing in a blood-red light. The ground trembled beneath me, splitting open to reveal jagged, steaming cracks. Shadows swirled in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that bent and writhed, never fully human, never fully monstrous. A voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere at once, deep and resonant, shaking my very bones. You defied what was mine. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. My knees buckled, and I collapsed in front of the altar, my scar burning, hotter than fire. The shadows circled closer, their whispers louder, coiling around me like snakes ready to strike. The deity's voice softened but became even more sinister. You wish to live? The question hung in the air, venomous and mocking. Yes, I choked out, barely audible. My words felt stolen, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The altar's symbols flared, and a figure began to rise from its center, formless but exuding power. It extended a clawed hand toward me. Your life. For a promise. Serve me. I froze, my heartbeat deafening. I didn't ask what it meant. I knew there was no other choice. Trembling, I nodded, my scar burning brighter in agreement. The shadows laughed, the deal sealed. But the whispers did not fade. The forest fell silent as the deity's shadowy form dissolved into the altar, leaving behind an unbearable stillness. My scar seared, a pain so sharp it felt like I was being branded from the inside out. I clutched my arm, but the glow only grew brighter, spreading tendrils of crimson light through my veins. My breath came in shallow gasps as I collapsed to the ground, the earth beneath me pulsing like a heartbeat. Then came the whispers, soft at first, but insistent. They weren't around me anymore, they were inside me, clawing at my mind. The forest shifted, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, their trunks resembling faces screaming in agony. A chill ran through my spine as I realized the whispers were not just voices, they were commands. Serve me, the deity's voice echoed, its tone colder than death. I struggled to stand, but my legs refused to obey. Instead, they moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the forest. My vision blurred, replaced by glimpses of horrors I couldn't comprehend. Villagers screaming, their faces melting into shadows. The altar consuming their essence. And at the center of it all, me standing, motionless, my scar glowing like a beacon. I had become the deity's vessel, bound to its will. The whispers promised that my service was eternal, but they did not promise mercy. I was no longer my own. What would you do if breaking a single rule meant condemning yourself to an eternity of servitude? Could you sacrifice everything to protect those you love? If faced with an ancient deity's wrath, how far would you go to make amends, or would you let the darkness consume you? When I first stumbled upon the old piano in my grandparents' dusty parlor, it seemed harmless, a relic of forgotten melodies and faded memories. But the first note I struck wasn't music, it was a scream. Now, every key I press opens a door, and something terrible is clawing its way through. The car's tires crunched over the gravel driveway, and I felt an inexplicable heaviness settle in my chest as I stepped out into the dim light of late afternoon. The old house loomed ahead, its peeling paint and sagging roof an eerie silhouette against the gray sky. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made the world feel unnaturally still, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me. As I approached the door, it creaked open slightly, revealing the faint glow of a single bulb in the entryway. The faint, familiar scent of lavender and mothballs wafted out, but there was something else beneath it, a metallic tang that set my nerves on edge. I paused, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against my back. Turning quickly, I scanned the empty yard and the thick trees beyond the property line. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Grandma greeted me at the door with a strained smile. Her eyes darted nervously over my shoulder as if expecting someone or something to follow me inside. "You came alone?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. Her question unsettled me. Of course I came alone. The living room felt smaller than I remembered. Shadows clung to the corners, deep and inky, despite the lamp's warm glow. My gaze drifted to the piano in the corner, its presence dominating the room. It was larger than I remembered, its ornate legs like clawed feet gripping the floor. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint shimmer ripple across its surface, like a heat wave in the dead of summer. Grandma's hand tightened on my arm, pulling me toward the kitchen. "Don't linger in there," she said, her voice quivering. "The house remembers things best left alone." The piano's keys seemed to glint in the dim light, as if daring me to disobey. Something about it felt alive. I couldn't help but wonder what memories was the house keeping, and why did it feel like they were waiting for me? The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that seemed to listen, wrapping around me like a damp shroud. My footsteps echoed faintly as I wandered back into the living room. Grandma had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the piano. It drew me in like a magnet, the faint glint of its keys catching my eye. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to move closer. The air seemed heavier around it, almost electric, like a summer storm waiting to break. My fingers hovered over the lid, trembling. When I lifted it, the smell of aged wood and something faintly sour hit me. A soft note played itself, though I hadn't touched a key. It wasn't loud, just a single, mournful hum like. The piano had sighed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The house was empty. The logical part of. My mind tried to dismiss it, maybe it was just an echo from the past. The piano settling, but deep down, I knew better. As I sat down on the creaky bench, a chill swept through me. My hands moved toward the keys of their own accord. The first note I struck reverberated too loudly, its echo stretching unnaturally long, as if the sound were being pulled into some bottomless void. Goosebumps prickled my arms. I played another note, and then another, forming a hauntingly familiar melody that I couldn't place. The shadows in the corners seemed to thicken, shifting closer. A faint whisper brushed against my ear, though the room was empty. My pulse quickened, and yet I couldn't stop playing. It felt as though the piano was playing me, each note demanding to be heard, dragging me deeper into its melody. The room grew colder, and I noticed something: the photographs on the wall, once filled with cheerful faces, now showed blurred, shadowy figures. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. And I knew this wasn't just a piano. It was a doorway to something far darker. The final note of the melody echoed unnaturally, swelling louder as though the piano had swallowed the room whole. My hands froze over the keys, trembling. Then, without warning, the piano played by itself. A dissonant, jarring chord that made my teeth ache. I stumbled back, the bench screeching across the floor. The air thickened, pressing against my chest, and the room seemed to darken, shadows stretching unnaturally long. In the silence that followed, a sharp creak rang out from the ceiling, followed by a guttural whisper, incomprehensible yet unmistakably close. The temperature plummeted. My breath formed in visible puffs, and the light from the single bulb above flickered violently. The walls seemed to ripple as if something immense and unseen was pressing against them. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement, something slithering just beyond my vision. I spun around, but nothing was there. Then I saw it: the photographs lining the walls were no longer filled with faces. In their place were empty, black voids, smudged as if clawed from within the frames. A deep, resonant hum began to emanate from the piano, vibrating through the floorboards, each pulse syncing with the erratic pounding of my heart. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and angry. They were coming from all around me, the words still garbled but filled with malice. I backed away, my legs trembling. But the moment I neared the doorway, the sound of splintering wood halted me. I turned to see the doorframe twisting, warping inward, as if sucked into the house itself. A sharp, icy gust blasted through the room, extinguishing the bulb. I was plunged into darkness, save for a faint, otherworldly glow emanating from the piano keys. One by one, the keys pressed down, forming a slow, deliberate melody. It was no longer playing music, it was summoning something. A shadow began to rise from behind the piano, its form wrong and shifting, like smoke trapped in a human shape. My legs refused to move, rooted by a terror I'd never known. The whispers coalesced into a single, ear-splitting scream, and I knew this wasn't just a curse. It was a nightmare come to life. The shadow solidified, becoming a figure cloaked in darkness, its edges rippling as though it were made of ink suspended in water. It loomed over the piano, hands if they could be called hands hovering above the glowing keys. Then it played. The melody it struck was unlike anything I'd ever heard, each note vibrating through my bones, turning my stomach inside out. The sound was alive, sharp and suffocating, growing louder as though it sought to drown me. I clutched my ears, but it was futile. The music wasn't coming through my ears. It was in my head. I stumbled back, colliding with the wall, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The figure turned toward me, its face or the absence of one tilting curiously. Shadows stretched from it, inching closer like black tendrils hungry for my warmth. A voice cold, hollow, and ancient rose above the music, speaking words I didn't understand, yet their meaning was clear. I was trespassing. The room swirled as though the air had become liquid, the furniture twisting and fading into nothingness. My lungs burned as if the very oxygen had been stolen. The figure stretched an arm toward me, shadows reaching, curling like smoke, and then it spoke my name. The figure lunged forward, its shadowy tendrils slithering across the floor toward me. Panic surged, but instinct pushed me to action. I grabbed the nearest object, a tarnished brass candlestick from the piano top, and swung wildly. The tendrils hissed as they recoiled, the shadow retreating momentarily, but the air around me thickened with malice. The piano began to play itself, the keys smashing down in chaotic, discordant rhythms. Each note sent a jolt of pain through my skull, as if the music were tearing apart my mind. The floor beneath me felt unstable, rippling like water, and I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. "Leave me alone," I screamed, but the words felt hollow against the oppressive presence. The shadow reformed, towering, its face now splitting into a grotesque mimicry of human features, eyes like bottomless voids, a mouth stretched too wide. The curse it carried pulsed around me, a suffocating aura of despair. Desperation overtook me. My hands fumbled to shut the piano lid, hoping to stop the cacophony. As I slammed it closed, the music ceased abruptly, and the room fell into a heavy silence. But the figure didn't vanish. Instead, it whispered, "You cannot silence me," before lunging once more, dragging the darkness with it. The figure's tendrils wrapped around my ankles, dragging me closer to the piano, which now resonated with an eerie hum despite the lid being shut. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, every nerve in my body screamed for escape, but the darkness was stronger, pulling me into its grasp. The piano lid snapped open, revealing keys glowing faintly with a sickly green light. A whisper clawed at my ears, "Play the final note." I shook my head violently. "No, I won't." The shadow figure loomed, its face splitting into a nightmarish grin. The whispers grew deafening, like a chorus of lost souls, their demands slicing through my thoughts. My trembling hand, beyond my control, reached for the glowing keys. As my finger pressed down, the note echoed with a bone-deep finality. The shadow screamed, imploding into the piano, which shut violently on its own. But the silence that followed wasn't peace, it was waiting. What would you do if your family's past tried to claim your soul? Would you dare strike another key, knowing what might answer? If every note you played brought you closer to a darkness you couldn't escape, would you stop or play the last note to see what happens?